What would you do if you had less than 2 hours left to live? Not in a vague philosophical sense, but literally a ticking clock, a countdown, and a promise of destruction that would wipe away everything you have ever known. This is exactly the position Iran found itself in on April 7th, 2026, and what happened next shocked the entire world. Before we go any further, if you find stories about high-stakes global conflict, military strategy, and diplomatic brinkmanship fascinating, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. This is the kind of deep analysis we do every single week, and you won't want to miss what comes next. The story begins not with a bang, but with a deadline. President Trump had issued what can only be described as an apocalyptic warning. He gave Iran a specific amount of time to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical shipping lanes on the planet. If they failed to comply, he promised widespread attacks on Iranian civilian infrastructure. These were not idle threats. The United States military had already been engaged in 5.5 weeks of intense warfare against Iran, and the violence had been relentless. By the time this deadline was about to expire, the human cost was staggering. At least 2,760 people had lost their lives in the U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran that began on February 28th. But the death toll did not stop there. Thousands more had been killed across the wider region as the conflict expanded beyond Iran's borders. The war had also triggered what experts were calling the biggest shock to the global energy industry in history. Oil tankers were stranded at sea, unable to move through waters that had become a war zone. Prices shot upward, affecting every single person who relies on fuel for their daily life. This was the real backdrop of the ceasefire. It was not some abstract exercise in diplomacy. It was a desperate attempt to stop a war that had already killed thousands and was threatening to destabilize the entire global economy. Now, here is where the story gets genuinely remarkable. For 38 straight days, Iran had publicly sworn that it would never negotiate under pressure. Their leaders insisted that they would only end the fighting on their own terms, when they were ready, and only after they were fully convinced that the United States and Israel had been permanently deterred from striking again. This was not just political posturing. This was a matter of national pride and survival. Then, with less than 2 hours remaining on Trump's deadline, Iran did exactly what it said it would never do. They agreed to sit down and negotiate a ceasefire. The specific timing of this reversal is what makes it so extraordinary. Trump posted on Truth Social that the United States would suspend bombing Iran, but he attached a very specific justification to that decision. He said, and I quote, "The reason for doing so is that we have already met and exceeded all military objectives, and are very far along with a definitive agreement concerning long-term peace with Iran and peace in the middle, the East. A 2-week period will allow the agreement to be finalized and consummated." This announcement came less than 2 hours before Trump's own deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. Iran, for its part, said it would allow ships to begin moving through the strait again. However, according to reporting from Al Jazeera, which is one of the most trusted sources for this kind of information, some people in Iran were angry and denounced their government for bowing to pressure. This detail is crucial because it tells you that this was not a decision that Iran's population universally welcomed as a diplomatic victory. In fact, a significant portion of the country viewed it as a betrayal. We need to understand why this decision was so painful for Iran to make. Professor Fouad Izadi from the University of Tehran spoke to Al Jazeera and captured the mood perfectly. He said, "The pessimism in Iran is probably more than in any other place because we've been attacked 2 times in the middle of negotiations." He was referring to 2 separate previous instances. The first was an earlier 12-day war alongside Israel the previous June. The second was the February 28th strikes that had opened this current war. Both of these attacks had come while negotiations were technically still ongoing. This history matters enormously because it explains why Iranian officials had spent 5.5 weeks refusing to negotiate at all. They had been burned twice before, they had trusted the process, and they had been attacked anyway. So agreeing to negotiate now, under this exact kind of last-minute deadline, pressure, represented a genuine reversal of their own stated position. And as we saw, a meaningful portion of their own domestic audience viewed it as a betrayal rather than a victory. To truly understand what forced Iran to make this decision, we have to look at what both sides had originally demanded. The gap between those original positions and what actually got agreed to reveals just how significant this forced concession really was. The United States had issued a 15-point plan on March 25th. It was sent to Iran through Pakistani mediators at a time when Tehran was publicly denying that any talks were even happening. Iran rejected it outright, calling it excessive. The core American demands included a 30-day ceasefire, the immediate reopening of the Strait of Hormuz, the decommissioning of Iran's nuclear facilities at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan, They demanded a permanent Iranian commitment to never pursue nuclear weapons or enrich uranium, even for civilian purposes. They wanted Iran to hand over all existing uranium stockpiles to the International Atomic Energy Agency. They demanded an end to Iran's support for regional proxies like Hezbollah, and they wanted strict limits on Iran's ballistic missile arsenal. In exchange, the United States would lift all sanctions, including the UN's snapback mechanism, and support electricity generation at Iran's Bushehr nuclear plant. Iran, for its part, came back with its own counterproposal. This was a 10-point plan delivered to the White House through Pakistani mediators as the war entered its 38th day. It came right after Trump had threatened to blow up Iran's power and energy plants, a threat that Al Jazeera's own reporting flagged as a violation of international law. Trump initially called Iran's plan a significant step, but he said it was not good enough. However, by the time of the actual ceasefire announcement, he was calling that same proposal workable as the basis for a final agreement. Iran's asks were genuinely ambitious. They wanted a fundamental U.S. commitment to non-aggression. They wanted controlled passage through the strait, specifically coordinated with Iran's own armed forces. This is important because it means Iran would retain real leverage over the waterway, rather than surrendering it. They demanded acceptance of Iran's nuclear enrichment program continuing. They wanted the lifting of all primary and secondary sanctions. They demanded an end to every outstanding IAEA and UN Security Council resolution against Iran. They wanted the withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from every base in the region. They demanded full compensation for war damages, funded specifically through fees charged to ships passing through the Strait of Hormuz. They wanted the release of all Iranian assets frozen abroad. And they wanted the ratification of all of this through a binding UN Security Council resolution. Now, here's where the insane part of this story crystallizes. When you compare what Iran originally demanded against what it actually got, the gap is genuinely stark. And it is Iran's own walked-back positions that tell the story most clearly. Iranian authorities had earlier vowed not to negotiate with the U.S. at all. They insisted that Tehran would only end the war on its own timeline, once fully assured that the U.S. and Israel had been deterred from striking again. Instead, under direct pressure from Pakistani mediators and reportedly from China as well, Iran reversed that position entirely. Rather than securing the immediate permanent ceasefire that their own stated red line had demanded, Iran accepted a temporary 2-week pause. This was an arrangement explicitly designed to give both sides room to negotiate, rather than a genuine lasting end to hostilities. The contrast becomes even sharper when you look at the issue of war reparations. Iran's own president, Masoud Pezeshkian, had specifically called for war reparations as a precondition for any ceasefire back on March 11th. That demand did not survive intact either. Iran's actual proposal, the one Trump eventually called workable, instead suggested that Iran would fund its own reconstruction through fees collected from ships transiting the Strait of Hormuz. This is a meaningfully weaker position than direct reparations paid by the United States and Israel, the two countries whose strikes had caused the damage in the first place. That is a genuine substantive concession. Iran traded a demand for direct compensation from the parties that struck it into a self-funding mechanism that depends on continued commercial shipping traffic actually flowing through a waterway that had for weeks been anything but safe or predictable. If you are enjoying this deep dive into one of the most intense geopolitical standoffs in recent history, please take a moment to hit that subscribe button. We break down complex global events into simple, compelling stories that you will not find anywhere else. Share this video with a friend who loves understanding the real forces that shape our world. There's also a genuinely messy, unresolved thread involving Lebanon that is worth including precisely because it shows how incomplete the ceasefire actually was. Even at the moment of its announcement, Iran had insisted for days that any ceasefire needed to extend to a halt in attacks on its regional allies, specifically Hezbollah and Lebanon. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif, in outlining the ceasefire he had personally helped mediate, said it would indeed cover Lebanon. But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu directly contradicted that. He stated publicly that the U.S.-Iran agreement did not include Lebanon at all. And then, according to Al Jazeera's reporting, hours after Netanyahu's statement, Israel launched its biggest bombing campaign of the entire war on Lebanon. They hit Beirut directly, leaving hundreds of people dead and wounded, according to Lebanese authorities. By that point, the overall Lebanese death toll for the war had reached at least 1,230. This specific contradiction is worth sitting with. A mediator publicly says the ceasefire covers Lebanon. Israel's own prime minister publicly says it does not. And then, within hours, Israel launches its heaviest bombing campaign of the war against exactly that country. This shows that this entire ceasefire announcement was not the clean, comprehensive resolution that its framing might suggest. Samir Puri from King's College London offered a genuinely sharp assessment of what this specific gap represents. He said, "That's the specific issue that Iran will find that Israel still has veto power over." Chris Featherstone, a political scientist at the University of York, added the other side of that same dynamic. He noted that Iran would be unlikely to let it go, as they will wish to show that they can still influence Middle Eastern power politics despite the U.S. strikes. These are two genuinely serious analysts independently flagging the exact same fault line as the most likely place this fragile arrangement could fall apart within days of the ceasefire being announced. It is worth thinking through what Puri's specific phrase, "Israel still has veto power over this piece of the agreement," actually reveals about the underlying power structure governing this entire ceasefire. It complicates any simple two-party framing of American pressure forcing, Iranian concessions. This was not really a negotiation between just two governments. It was a three-way arrangement where Israel, despite not being a formal signatory to the specific U.S.-Iran ceasefire text, retained enough independent military capability and political will to unilaterally act against Iran's interests. They struck Lebanon at the exact moment their own prime minister was publicly disputing whether that country fell under the agreement's protection at all. That dynamic tells you something important about the actual limits of what Iran secured through this entire process. Even after being forced into accepting an American-brokered ceasefire under an apocalyptic deadline, Tehran still could not fully guarantee protection for its own regional allies. A third party with its own independent military capability and its own separate calculus about what its interests required was never fully bound by whatever terms Washington and Tehran had actually agreed to between themselves. Now, it is important to be equally precise about what the United States itself gave up here. This was not a one-sided story of Iran simply capitulating to every American demand. On the Strait of Hormuz specifically, Trump had demanded free and safe passage. This included an explosive-laden social media post threatening to bomb Iran's civilian infrastructure if that demand was not met. He had also earlier demanded Iran's outright unconditional surrender. What Iran actually agreed to preserves something meaningfully different. Iran retains control of the strait under the ceasefire agreement, continuing to collect fees from ships passing through it to fund reconstruction. This is exactly the kind of ongoing leverage over the waterway that Iran's own 10-point plan had specifically demanded, and the American 15-point plan had specifically tried to strip away. That is a real substantive American concession, not a footnote. The missile question tells a similarly revealing story about what quietly disappeared from the American side of the table. Throughout the war, the United States had insisted it would keep fighting specifically to degrade Iran's ballistic missile program. They framed severe limits or outright dismantlement of that capability as a required condition for peace. But in every statement Trump made, leading up to and following the ceasefire announcement, Al Jazeera's reporting notes that he said nothing at all about Iran's missiles. That is an entire previously non-negotiable American demand that simply vanished from the public conversation at the exact moment the ceasefire was struck. This is worth flagging precisely because silence on a previously loudly stated demand is itself a meaningful signal about what actually got traded away behind closed doors to get this deal done in time. It is worth explaining exactly why the missile silence deserves more attention than it typically gets in coverage of this ceasefire. It represents one of the clearest examples in this entire negotiation of a loudly stated red line simply evaporating, without any public acknowledgement. Throughout the war, American officials had repeatedly and specifically framed Iran's ballistic missile capability as a core non-negotiable target. They argued that any lasting peace required either severe limitations or outright dismantlement of the program. That is not a minor technical demand. Ballistic missiles represent one of Iran's few remaining means of projecting force at range against adversaries with vastly superior air power. It is precisely the kind of asymmetric capability a country in Iran's position has every strategic incentive to protect above almost anything else on the negotiating table. The fact that this specific demand simply disappeared from Trump's own public statements without any announcement that it had been dropped, without any explanation of why, suggests it was likely traded away in the actual closed-door negotiating process. It was the price of getting Iran to the table at all under this specific timeline. This is a genuine substantive American concession that received essentially none of the public attention the more dramatic ceasefire announcement itself generated. This is a pattern worth remembering whenever a ceasefire or peace deal gets announced with dramatic headline-grabbing language. The quiet, unstated concessions buried inside the actual terms often matter more for understanding who really gave up what than anything either government says publicly about the agreement in the hours immediately following its announcement. Let us talk about what did not get resolved at all. The article's own forward-looking analysis is genuinely important for understanding just how fragile this specific forced concession actually was from the moment it was announced. Iran's demand for the complete withdrawal of U.S. combat forces from every regional base was flagged directly as a non-starter for Washington. The United States has maintained a continuous military presence in the Middle East for more than 65 years. They have roughly 50,000 troops stationed across 19 separate sites. This does not even count the additional thousands that were called up specifically because of this war. Iran argued that those very bases had proven to be a liability for the Gulf countries hosting them throughout this conflict. They became direct targets of Iranian retaliatory strikes precisely because they hosted American forces. Izzati's own comment on this point is worth including because of its careful, almost diplomatic phrasing. He said, "These countries are all sovereign countries. They make their own decisions," while still noting that the experience our southern neighbors had with U.S. bases was not good. That is, Iran publicly acknowledging it can pressure and criticize this arrangement without actually being able to force sovereign Gulf governments to evict American forces from their own territory. This is a genuine limit on how far Tehran's leverage in these negotiations could actually reach. It is worth pausing on the specific mechanics of how this negotiation actually happened, because the fact that it ran entirely through Pakistani mediation rather than any direct American-Iranian channel tells you something important about how little direct trust existed between the two governments, even as they were reaching an agreement. Both the American 15-point plan and Iran's own 10-point counterproposal were delivered through Pakistani intermediaries. Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif was personally involved enough in the process to be the one publicly outlining the ceasefire's terms, including the disputed claim about Lebanon's inclusion. That reliance on a third-party mediator, rather than any direct diplomatic channel between Washington and Tehran, reflects the genuine depth of hostility and mistrust that had built up over 5.5 weeks of active warfare. These were two governments that needed an outside party to physically carry documents back and forth, because they were not in any position to negotiate with each other directly. It is also worth explaining exactly why Trump's specific choice of words, "We have already met and exceeded all military objectives," matters so much for understanding the actual American calculation behind this pause. That is a carefully constructed piece of political messaging. It frames the ceasefire not as a response to Iran's concessions or to mounting international pressure, but as a unilateral American decision made from a position of total strength. It was timed specifically because Washington had already accomplished everything it set out to achieve militarily. Whether that claim reflects genuine military assessment, or simply the kind of framing any government reaches for when trying to present a negotiated pause as a victory rather than a retreat, is worth treating with real skepticism. It is the same kind of self-serving characterization that Iran's own state media was simultaneously offering in the opposite direction, describing the very same ceasefire as a forced American surrender. Both governments had strong incentives to claim victory publicly regardless of what actually happened behind closed doors. This is exactly why the concrete specific concessions documented in Al Jazeera's reporting, not the surrounding rhetoric from either side, are the part of this story worth actually trusting. Now, let us spend more time on the China angle specifically, because Al Jazeera's reporting flags it almost in passing, but it is genuinely significant, if accurate. The claim that Iran yielded not just to Pakistani mediation pressure, but reportedly to pressure from China as well, suggests Beijing was playing an active, if less publicly visible, role in pushing Tehran toward the negotiating table. That would make sense, given China's own substantial economic stake in Iranian oil exports and in regional stability more broadly. A prolonged war disrupting global energy markets and Gulf shipping lanes carries real costs for an economy as dependent on stable energy imports as China's. If Beijing genuinely applied direct pressure on Iran to accept this deal, that is a meaningful data point about how this war had already begun drawing in major power interests well beyond just the US, Israel, and Iran directly. China was using whatever economic and diplomatic leverage it holds over Tehran to push toward de-escalation, specifically because continued disruption of Gulf shipping and energy markets threatened its own economic interests. It is worth returning to Izzati's specific framing of Iranian public sentiment, because the detail about two prior instances of being struck during active negotiations is not just useful historical context. It is the actual psychological lens through which a meaningful share of the Iranian public was evaluating this new ceasefire in real time. If your government has twice before entered negotiations, only to be struck again while talks were supposedly ongoing, agreeing to yet another ceasefire, even one framed as buying time to finalize a lasting peace, reasonably leads a skeptical domestic audience to view it as setting up a third betrayal rather than a genuine step toward resolution. That skepticism is not irrational paranoia. It is a direct evidence-based response to a specific repeated pattern that this exact population had already lived through twice. Understanding that history is essential for understanding why Iranian officials agreeing to the ceasefire, even under enormous external pressure, represented such a genuinely risky domestic political move. It required them to ask their own population to trust a process that had failed to protect them from renewed strikes on 2 previous occasions. So let us pull this together into an honest, complete answer about what the United States actually forced Iran to do and what it cost Washington to get there. Iran, after 5.5 weeks of publicly repeatedly insisting it would never negotiate under pressure and would only end this war entirely on its own terms, agreed to sit down at the table with less than 2 hours left on a deadline attached to a threat of civilizational scale destruction. It accepted a temporary 2-week ceasefire instead of the permanent one it had originally demanded. It quietly walked back a presidential call for direct war reparations in favor of a self-funded reconstruction mechanism tied to Hormuz shipping fees. And it did all of this while a meaningful portion of its own domestic population, still remembering 2 prior instances of being struck during active negotiations, watched with open anger and distrust rather than celebration. But the United States gave real ground too. It dropped its demand for Iran's unconditional surrender. It allowed Iran to retain genuine operational control over the Strait of Hormuz rather than surrendering that leverage entirely. And it went conspicuously silent on the ballistic missile limitations it had spent weeks insisting were non-negotiable. Underneath all of it sat an unresolved, actively contradicted question about whether the ceasefire even covered Lebanon at all. This was a contradiction that Israel had already acted on with its heaviest bombing campaign of the war within hours of the deal being announced. This is the real, fully sourced story of what forcing Iran into this specific ceasefire actually meant. It was not a clean American victory or a clean Iranian capitulation. It was a genuinely lopsided, genuinely fragile arrangement built on a 2-hour deadline and an apocalyptic threat that both governments needed publicly to call a win. Independent analysts from the very first day it was announced were already warning that it contained exactly the fault lines that would determine whether it held or collapsed once the actual negotiating began. We are almost at the end of this analysis, but before we finish, I want to ask you something important. If you have made it this far, you care about understanding the real forces that shape our world. So please, take a second to hit that like button. It helps more people find this content and understand these complex issues. And if you want to stay updated on future deep dives, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We release new videos every week that break down the most important global events in a way that is easy to understand and impossible to forget. It is also worth putting real weight on that 65-year, 50,000 troop figure because it illustrates just how structurally unrealistic Iran's demand for full American withdrawal always was. Regardless of how much military pressure Iran was able to bring to bear during this specific war, American military presence across the Middle East is not a temporary wartime deployment that could plausibly be negotiated away as part of a single ceasefire agreement. It is a decades-old strategic architecture built through individual agreements with 19 separate host governments. Each of these governments has its own distinct security relationship with Washington, predating this conflict by generations in some cases. Asking the United States to abandon that entire architecture as a condition of ending this specific war was always functionally asking for something well beyond what any single negotiation, however much leverage either side held, at any given moment was realistically going to achieve. That is precisely why analysts flagged it immediately as a non-starter rather than a genuine point of ongoing negotiation. It is worth understanding as the clearest example in Iran's entire 10-point proposal of a demand that functioned more as a maximalist opening position than something Tehran's own negotiators likely expected to actually secure. It is worth closing on why the specific framing of Iran's retained control over the Strait of Hormuz matters so much more than it might initially seem. It is arguably the single most consequential detail buried in this entire agreement. Trump's original demand was not just for safe passage, it was for Iran's outright unconditional surrender, language that implied Iran would lose any meaningful say over one of the most economically vital waterways on the planet. What Iran actually walked away with instead, continued operational control, continued fee collection for passing ships, meant Tehran preserved the exact same fundamental leverage over global oil shipping that had made it such a formidable adversary throughout this entire war in the first place. That is not a minor technical detail buried in a ceasefire agreement. It is the preservation of Iran's single most powerful card. The one piece of geography that gives a country with a badly damaged conventional military genuine continuing influence over the global economy, regardless of how much of its air defense network or naval capability had been degraded by that point in the war. Every other concession documented in this account, the shift from permanent to temporary ceasefire, the quiet abandonment of direct reparations, the reversal of The no-negotiation stance itself becomes considerably easier for Iranian officials to defend domestically once you understand that the single most valuable strategic asset in this entire conflict, control over roughly a fifth of the world's oil shipping, never actually left Iran's hands. That single preserved point of leverage helps explain something that might otherwise seem contradictory. How a country that had just been forced into abandoning its no-negotiation stance, accepting only a temporary rather than permanent ceasefire and quietly dropping its reparations demand, could still walk away from this specific moment with a genuine claim to having preserved its core strategic position. Iran gave up the optics of firmness and the specific financial terms it had originally sought. But it did not give up the actual physical leverage over Hormuz that had made this entire war so economically costly for everyone involved in the first place. That is precisely why both sides could credibly claim victory to their own domestic audiences simultaneously. Each side actually did walk away having preserved something it considered essential, even while conceding ground on almost everything else that had been publicly and loudly demanded. In the weeks leading up to that final 2-hour countdown to an apocalyptic deadline, neither side in the end actually wanted to see that deadline triggered. The threat had been made, the pressure had been applied, and in the final moments, Iran blinked. But in the final moments, the United States also blinked. They both stepped back from the brink. They both gave something up. And for now, at least, the fighting has stopped. But the question that remains is how long that will last. Because when the underlying tensions are this deep, when the mistrust is this profound, and when the fault lines are this clear, a temporary pause is never really the end of the story. It is just the beginning of the next chapter.